Good evening. I'm Captain Marcus Brooks. After 28 years in the skies, I thought I'd seen every kind of passenger. I was wrong. Tonight's story is about a slap that lasted less than a second and a truth that took 6 minutes to catch up with the whole cabin. This is the story of Flight 884. Yolanda Price boarded Flight 884 from Atlanta to Chicago the way she always traveled, quietly, plainly, a simple black cardigan over a white blouse, a leather tote bag over one shoulder, reading glasses pushed up into her hair. She was 53, medium build, unremarkable in every way a person can be unremarkable when they've spent 30 years learning that drawing attention rarely served her well. She settled into seat 2A, stowed her tote beneath the seat ahead of her, and pulled out a paperback novel, the way she did on every flight she'd taken over the past 3 decades, and there had been hundreds, more than most passengers on this aircraft would ever accumulate in a lifetime. What none of the other first-class passengers knew, what the flight attendant working that cabin had no reason to suspect, was that Yolanda Price was the founder and majority owner of Crestline Regional Holdings, the parent company that had acquired a controlling stake in this exact airline 6 years earlier during a restructuring that had saved nearly 4,000 jobs from a bankruptcy filing that would have ended them. She sat on the board. She approved the annual budget. Her signature, in a smaller, more private way than most people would recognize, was on the very seat she now occupied. She never mentioned any of it while traveling. She'd learned early in her career, coming up through logistics and operations management in an industry that hadn't made much room for her, that people treated her very differently depending on whether they knew what she was worth. And she'd found, over the years, that the version of the world she got to see without that knowledge attached was more honest, if occasionally more painful. The flight attendant working first class that day was a woman named Deb Halloran, mid-40s, 14 years with the airline, competent by most measures, but carrying a particular brittleness that day that had nothing to do with Yolanda and everything to do with a rough morning, a canceled connecting flight of her own the night before, and a general fraying patience that had been building since well before boarding began. Deb moved through the cabin doing her pre-departure checks, pausing at row 2. "Ma'am, I need to see your boarding pass again, please." Yolanda looked up, mildly puzzled. "I showed it at the gate." "I understand, but there's a discrepancy showing on my manifest. I need to verify." Yolanda handed over her boarding pass without complaint, watching Deb scan it with a handheld device. It beeped green, confirmed, valid, seat 2A. "That's strange," Deb muttered, more to herself than to Yolanda, and moved on without further explanation, leaving Yolanda faintly unsettled but unwilling to make an issue of something so minor. 20 minutes later, as boarding was finishing, a man in an expensive suit approached row 2, glancing at a boarding pass in his hand, then at Yolanda, his expression shifting into something impatient. "Excuse me," he said to Deb, who was nearby. "I think there's been a mix-up. My assistant booked me 2A. Deb checked her tablet, frowning. "Let me look into this." She approached Yolanda again. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to move to a different seat. There's been a booking error, and this gentleman's reservation takes priority." Yolanda set her book down carefully, keeping her voice even. "My boarding pass scanned as valid 20 minutes ago. You confirmed it yourself. What exactly is the error?" "I don't have time to explain the full system logic to you right now," Deb said, her patience visibly thinning. "I need this seat cleared so we can board on schedule." "I'm not moving without an actual explanation," Yolanda said, calm but firm. "I paid for this seat. If there's a genuine conflict, I'd like to understand what it is before I give it up." The businessman shifted uncomfortably, sensing the tension escalating beyond what he'd intended to trigger. "Look, if it's an issue, I can take another seat." "No," Deb snapped, cutting him off, her frustration now fully directed at Yolanda instead. "Ma'am, I need you to gather your things and move to the back of the aircraft. Now, you're holding up the entire boarding process." Several nearby passengers had gone quiet, watching the exchange with the particular discomfort of people sensing something had shifted from a simple mix-up into something uglier. "I'm not holding anything up," Yolanda said. "I'm asking a reasonable question about why a confirmed, valid seat is suddenly being reassigned." Deb reached down and grabbed Yolanda's tote bag from beneath the seat, an aggressive, unmistakable gesture. "Get up. Get out of first class. This seat belongs to someone who actually needs it." Yolanda stood, more out of instinct to protect her belongings than compliance, reaching for her tote. "You do not need to grab my things." What happened next took less than a second. Deb's open hand connected sharply with the side of Yolanda's face. Not a shove, not an accidental collision in a crowded aisle, but a deliberate, open-palmed slap, the sound of it cutting through the cabin like a gunshot in the sudden silence that followed. Nobody moved for a long moment. Yolanda's hand rose slowly to her cheek, more in disbelief than pain, though the pain was real too, a hot sting spreading across her jaw. The businessman, still standing in the aisle, took a visible step backward, his mouth open, no words coming out. 2 rows back, a woman gasped audibly. Somewhere behind them, a phone came out, already recording, the way phones always seem to appear in exactly these moments. Deb herself looked almost as shocked as everyone around her, her hands still slightly raised, as though her own body had acted before her mind had fully caught up to what she was doing. Yolanda started, her voice quiet, controlled despite the visible tremor beneath it. You just struck me. You wouldn't move, Deb said, the words coming out defensive and hollow, even as she said them, already sensing the ground shifting beneath her. A senior flight attendant working the forward galley, a man named Curtis Owens, had heard the commotion and hurried over, taking in the scene, Yolanda's hand still on her cheek, Deb frozen mid-justification, the entire first-class cabin gone completely silent. What happened here? Curtis asked, his voice sharp with alarm. She refused to move, Deb said quickly. There was a seating conflict and she wouldn't cooperate and You hit her, the businessman said, finding his voice again. I watched it happen. She didn't do anything. You grabbed her bag and then you slapped her. Curtis looked at Yolanda, his expression shifting from professional concern into something more serious. Ma'am, are you all right? Do you need medical attention? I need someone to explain why a valid, confirmed seat became a problem that ended with me being struck, Yolanda said, her composure holding despite everything, though her eyes had gone hard in a way that hadn't been there 20 minutes earlier. Curtis pulled out his own tablet, checking the manifest himself with careful, deliberate keystrokes, wanting to understand exactly what had actually happened before anything else moved forward. He scrolled through the passenger list, found row 2, found the name attached to seat 2A, Price, Yolanda M. He paused. Something about the name tugged at his memory, not immediately, but with the persistent itch of recognition he couldn't quite place. He'd worked for the airline 11 years, sat through every mandatory training session, every town hall, every quarterly update where senior leadership occasionally mentioned board members by name. Then it landed, all at once, with a cold certainty that made his stomach drop. Crestline Regional Holdings, Board of Directors, Yolanda Price. He'd seen her name, never her face, not until this moment, on internal memos, on the town hall slide that had introduced the ownership group after the restructuring 6 years earlier, on the very letterhead of the memo that had saved his own job during that period. Ma'am, Curtis said slowly, his voice changing entirely. Is your full name Yolanda Price? With Crestline? Yolanda looked at him, still holding her cheek, something flickering across her expression. Not surprise exactly, more a kind of tired recognition that this particular reveal was about to happen, the way it always eventually did. Yes, Curtis's face went through several rapid changes, landing finally on something close to horror. He turned to Deb, who was watching this exchange with dawning confusion. Deb, he said quietly, do you know who you just hit? What? No. Who is she? She's on the board, Curtis said. She's part of the ownership group. She's not just a passenger, Deb. She's one of the people this airline answers to. Deb's face drained of color in stages, the same way a person's does when the full weight of a mistake arrives all at once instead of gradually. I didn't know. I swear I didn't know. That's not the point, and you know it, Curtis said, his voice tight. You hit a passenger. It wouldn't matter if she owned the airline or was flying with us for the very first time. You struck her. The captain, a man named Rick Alvarez, had been informed by this point through the interphone and stepped out of the cockpit to assess the situation directly, his expression grave as he took in the scene. Yolanda still standing, composed but visibly shaken, the businessman and several other passengers now openly recounting what they'd witnessed, phones held up, one clip already circulating quietly among nearby seats. Miss Price, Rick said, having clearly been briefed in the seconds before arriving, I am deeply sorry this happened on my aircraft. Please, take my seat in the cockpit jump seat if you'd like somewhere quiet, or we can arrange for you to be seen by medical personnel before we depart. I'm all right, Yolanda said, though her voice carried a rawness that suggested otherwise. I'd like this handled properly, not smoothed over, properly. It will be, Rick said. I'm required to file an incident report regardless of anything else, and given the circumstances, I'm also required to hold this aircraft until airport security has taken statements. He turned to Deb. You're relieved of duty for this flight, effective immediately. Please gather your things and wait in the terminal. Security will need to speak with you. Deb's composure finally broke entirely, tears springing up, her hands shaking. Please, I have 2 kids. This is my job. I made a mistake. I panicked. You struck a passenger, Rick said, not unkindly, but without room for negotiation either. There isn't a version of this job where that's survivable, regardless of who she turned out to be. If you'd hit anyone in this cabin, we'd be having this same conversation. Curtis stepped in to cover the first-class service for the remainder of boarding, personally checking on Yolanda every few minutes, bringing her water, adjusting the temperature near her seat, treating her with a level of care that felt, to Yolanda, both appropriate and slightly uncomfortable, given how differently she'd been treated only 20 minutes earlier. The businessman who'd unknowingly triggered the whole confrontation approached her quietly before takeoff, his own seat reassigned elsewhere without further complaint on his part. "I am so sorry. I had no idea this would happen. I never wanted anyone hurt over a seating mix-up." "It's not your fault," Yolanda said, and meant it. "You didn't hit me. You didn't decide I wasn't worth listening to before things escalated. That decision belonged entirely to someone else." Airport security boarded before departure, took statements from Yolanda, Curtis, the businessman, and 2 other passengers who'd witnessed the incident clearly. Deb was escorted off the aircraft, her employment status suspended pending formal review, though everyone involved understood, without anyone needing to say it explicitly, that suspension was a formality on the way to termination. The flight departed 90 minutes behind schedule. Yolanda, offered the choice to deplane and rebook, chose instead to stay, quietly telling Curtis she didn't want the incident to cost anyone else their travel plans, on top of everything else that had already gone wrong that morning. 3 weeks later, the airline's Human Resources Department completed its formal investigation. Deb Halloran was terminated, the incident report noting not just the physical altercation itself, but a pattern of 3 prior passenger complaints over the preceding 2 years that had each resulted only in verbal counseling rather than any substantive consequence. Complaints that, when reviewed together for the first time during this investigation, painted a picture leadership had simply never bothered to look at closely until it was forced to. Yolanda used her position on the board not to seek any personal satisfaction from the outcome, but to push through a policy change she'd been quietly advocating for over a year without much traction. A mandatory de-escalation and bias training program for all customer-facing staff, funded fully by the company rather than treated as an optional add-on, along with a genuine, tracked complaint escalation system that would prevent exactly the kind of pattern that had gone unnoticed in Deb's file for 2 years. Curtis Owens received a formal commendation for his handling of the incident, and months later was promoted into a training role specifically because of the calm, immediate clarity he'd shown that day, the instinct to treat the situation seriously before he'd even known who Yolanda was, an instinct the airline decided was worth institutionalizing rather than leaving to chance. Yolanda herself never spoke publicly about the incident, declining 2 separate interview requests from local news outlets who'd picked up the story after the passenger's video quietly went viral within aviation circles. When a board colleague asked her privately, months later, why she hadn't used the moment to make a bigger public statement about accountability in the industry, she simply said, "The point was never to be seen fixing it. The point was to actually fix it. Those aren't always the same project." She kept flying commercial, in the same plain cardigans, the same worn paperbacks tucked into the same leather tote, exactly the way she always had, because the version of the world she got to see traveling quietly, unremarkably, without anyone knowing her name, remained, to her, worth more than any comfort her title could have bought her instead. That's the story of Flight 884. Yolanda Price didn't need anyone to recognize her name to know she deserved better than what she got that morning. The recognition just made sure the consequences actually landed where they belonged. At 35,000 feet, everyone wears the same seatbelt. But dignity was never something anyone had the right to slap out of a person in the first place. If this story moved you, hit subscribe. There's always another flight, and always someone worth treating with care before you ever find out who they really are.